everybody to our Training Journal webinar, and let me just very first of all start by kind of welcoming all of you with this little note.
And now it's time for TJwow.
Oh, I do love that bit. So this is me. I'm your host today and the Deputy Editor of Training Journal, and I'm really looking forward to chatting with all of you. If you've been on our webinars before, as a lot of you have done, you will absolutely know that the whole point of these is to have conversation. Any training session you go to, any conference, I always find the best bit is actually conversing, is actually talking about the topic and the learning. And that's where I get most from things. Maybe over coffee, maybe, knowing me, probably in the pub. So this is what we're trying to do today. Maybe less of the alcohol, but certainly more of the conversation. You've got the chat window there on the right. You are using that absolutely fabulously. Please do go and share your Twitter handles if you want to connect with each other. We've also got the question pod there. So the Q&A pod, if you want to make sure a question isn't missed, please do and go and type something in there. It won't be seen by everyone, but I promise you I'll see it and we'll address it as soon as we can. If you're thinking, actually, I'd like to say something on audio and unmute, all you have to do is actually just click the raise hand icon at the top of the window. So all you have to do is click the hand up, I'll see that and I'll say, hey, Janet or Danielle or Debbie, let's unmute and see what you've got to say. But otherwise, you've definitely got that chat window that you can use. You can join us on Twitter if you want to. We've got John Kennard, our editor, who is going to be kind of tweeting things on the back channel so that you can see those there. And all of our sessions are recorded. They're all available on our website. You can go and have a look at that another day, anytime. But first of all, I think what we need to do now is kind of jump straight into this and actually find out a little bit more about all of this topic, what you bring to this, and also our speakers. So let's bring in our video now. So we're going to bring in our webcam so you can see us all. Here we are, we're real, we're live, we can have a little wave. And what we're going to do is we're just going to do some very short introductions and then kind of start discussing this concept by actually answering, well, what is neuroscience in the first place? That's a good place to start. So on my screen, I can see Stella, Gary and Margie. So I think we're going to go round in that order. So Stella, just tell us very briefly a little bit about what it is that you do.
Okay, so I run a company called Stella Learning. We specialise in supporting people with communication skills, particularly train the type stuff, but helping them understand the neuroscience or the psychology and the learning behind, sitting behind what they do in terms of getting improvements at work.
Thank you very much. And Gary, tell us a little bit about yourself, not your Twitter handle, obviously, but tell us a little bit about you.
Hi everyone, so my name's Gayle Often. I'm an occupational psychologist and I co-run a company called Think Change Consulting. And what we do, we bring together neuroscience and psychology and turn it into something practical in the workplace. And earlier, Joe, you said, what is neuroscience? I was thinking when I first started to study it at uni, it wasn't called that, it was called biological psychology. And I'd say nowadays, I think the technical term is everyone gets their knickers in a twist about, is it neuroscience, is it psychology? I would like us to focus on, is it good quality evidence and can you do something with it? And
love
use
that,
as
Gary. Thank you very much. And Margie, tell us a little bit about who you are and also where you are and what time it is, just so everybody can appreciate this even more than normal.
Okay. Well, let's start with that. I'm in a little bitty town outside of Phoenix, Arizona. There are more coyotes, I think, than people here. And it is 2:05 a.m. So I'm really honored to be here with everybody. As you're going to hear a common theme, I am the president of Learning to Go. And what we do is we help people apply the many neurosciences because, as Gary and Stella are both pointing out, it's not just the biology, it's the psychology, it's the chemistry, it's even the quantum physics of what's going on in your brain that can sometimes give us practical insights in how to apply them. So I help people apply those sciences to enhance learning and performance. I'm the author of Brain Matters, How to Help Anyone Learn Anything Using Neuroscience. And we also have an online learning site called Learning Binge. So we hope you check out Learning to Go and all of those things. To me, neuroscience is understanding how the brain works physically. And I think that's a distinction between psychology, where we can't see what's happening, and it's still very good evidentiary science, but it is built on observation of behavior. Neuroscience is built on watching actual physical changes in the brain and matching them to behavior and understanding what happens. It's a distinction that probably doesn't matter to the learning professional. What we care about is, can we use it? What information can we use? And it's so hard to keep up with it. So that's why we're all here today, to tell you how you can use it, what parts of the evidence are already quite useful and insightful.
Absolutely. I think it's such an interesting area. It's a diverse area. And as you say, it's hard to keep up with all of this. And Stella, what is neuroscience for you? How do you define it?
I define it quite broadly, and I guess I do include the psychology. That's probably because when I was at university, we were looking at changes in brains, sort of physical changes based on, what behaviours people were doing, and looking at what happened if brains changed, what behaviours changed as well. So I guess for me, neuroscience is anything that's to do with the study of how the brain works and functions and how that impacts on behaviours. And very much like Gary, I'm really interested in the practical application of it, because some of it is really, really interesting, but actually perhaps not so easy for us to apply practically, and I'm interested in the practical.
And I think I remember chatting to a few people recently and saying, well, all the research is amazing, and if you're a neuroscientist or a biologist or a chemist or whatever your particular area is, that's fascinating. But what am I going to do in my design tomorrow? What am I going to do in my classroom? What am I going to do on my webinar? What's the actual practical use of these things? So let's start with just a couple of ideas about not necessarily what to do, but actually how to make it practical. Let's start with, well, how do we go from what we see, what we read, and then thinking about how can I apply that to my practice? So let's start with Stella, and then Gary, and then Margie again. How can we make this practical? What are your thoughts around that?
I think we often have to go from the really complex scientific stuff that is, can be very difficult to read, can be very difficult to understand, can also be incredibly, it's sort of often micro information, very limited to, small groups, small activities. And I think it's about trying to understand, get a better picture for the bigger picture. So looking at sites that perhaps analyse some of that very detailed science, so things like the BPS, British Psychological Society Digest, is a really good place to start off thinking about where you might get something more practical, because they tend to make it easy to digest rather than very complex, not always very well written scientific papers.
Yeah, there's a difference between well written that we can understand and apply and something else. And Keith makes a really good point here in the chat window and says, I'd like us to clarify as we go, theory versus purely empirical. And that word empirical is really important, that kind of absolutely proven with research, with data and so on. And Keith says, for example, recently the way we actually form memories has been redefined. So you make a really good point there, Keith. So we'll definitely try and keep that in mind when we do that. To Gary. Yeah, go ahead, Gary.
Can I just pick up on Keith's point? Just to clarify, Keith, are you talking about this study about long-term and short-term memories being produced at the same time? Is that the one? Yeah. Because I was speaking to a neuroscientist last week from Trinity University, and I asked him about that question. I said, what did he make of it? Does that mean that both, we don't need to talk about repetition and moving from long-term to short-term? And he gave a cautionary note, even this quite empirically robust data. He was saying, well, first of all, it's in mice, so it may not translate to humans exactly, but he said it was very particularly around stress and anxiety. So he said, even though the data's good, it may be that it's memory formation to do with stress and anxiety, but maybe memorizing facts or a skill that might be handled in a slightly different way. So I think it's a great place to start, just in terms of, just because something is scientifically robust and evidence-based, there is still problems potentially in how we interpret it and how we apply things. So I don't think I've answered any questions there, but probably just picked at a scab that opens up more and more kind of questions. But I think it's good for us to be informed in terms of, just because it's presented and it is good quality evidence, doesn't mean to say we have to change all of our concepts about how people are and how they interact, for example.
Yeah, absolutely, really important about, and I think this kind of comes to the crux of it is, and Keith has just said this, yes, interpretation is key, as that's where theory comes in, and then it's a guess. And Sharon, don't worry, it wasn't you. There was some bit of background noise there, but we found out who it was and we've muted them. It's just one of those lovely challenges of, we definitely want to hear you and get your voices in, just not necessarily when you don't realise it. So don't worry, Sharon, it wasn't you. And there's some other things being kind of shared here as well. So and Danielle asks, are there any other digests like the British Psychological Society, I think it was, that you'd all recommend? So if you do, you can drop that in the chat window or have a think about that. And also, you know, we've got 60 odd people here today. So what are your thoughts, everybody? What do you want to share? What do you use to keep up to date in this field? You know, if you've got blog posts or websites that you follow or something like that, do share that if they're your own, if they're somebody else's. That's why we're here, is to share all of that today. So do please do that.
Yes. Shall I answer the original question now, Jai? Sorry.
On trying to make this practical.
Yeah, so I think Keith opened up a good point in terms of, you know, where do we get our data from? Are we up to date maybe in what the research world is saying? So I think if you are a practitioner who's trying to translate what research is saying and bring it to an individual or an organisation, we have a duty of care to pick the stuff that we think is evidence, you know, is robust from an evidence point of view, but also we can see some kind of this is how it could be applied in this, that, and the other situation. But what I'd say, what we typically do in our in our work is we will present some research, some understanding about the brain, and then we typically will give time and space and maybe some structure for the individual or the group to try and work out, well, actually, so what? Great that you're telling us this, Gary, but how does it make sense for me? Because if I tell them it and it doesn't make sense to them, I've kind of lost them. Whereas if they work it out themselves, and in the neuroscience would suggest also that it has a much bigger impact if we kind of join the dots ourselves of, oh, that could affect how I run performance management or change management communication. So I'd say there's probably a bit of a duty of care from us, but then give some time and space, structure, to allow people to work some of that stuff out themselves.
Thank you, Gary. And I think you make a great point there. You know, I think we all know as trainers, as designers, that when people kind of learn things for themselves, it's more powerful. But being able to understand what's behind that is really the key to kind of applying neuroscience in the workplace. So Margie, from your perspective, you know, how can we make this more practical, this stuff that's out there? What do you recommend to people?
Well, I think it's important, first of all, and I'll probably repeat a little bit about what both Gary and Stella have been saying, is to keep in mind that this is a very new, as science goes, a very new pursuit of knowledge. And because of that, we are finding that something that was discovered 2 years ago, a year ago, another study can come out and can change that understanding. And so one of the first things you have to do is be ready to be flexible and to accept the fact that it isn't set in stone, that in fact our understanding of how the brain works, how the mind works, which some people draw a distinction that those are two somewhat different things. I'm not sure that's particularly useful for a learner practitioner. But understanding those things, you have to also be ready that the science may take us in a new direction. On the other hand, sometimes it validates what we've already known, what those of us who got our training in education learned years ago. The research validates it and says the same thing, that we learned years ago, but now we've watched a brain in action doing it, and very active cognition sometimes, and that's terribly exciting. And some of the excitement, unfortunately, leads to oversimplification. Some people just looking, quite honestly, to cash in. And so there were all these cottage industries about the neuroscience of this and the neuroscience of that. And if you pay us $200, we'll certify you. And you have to be very careful. If somebody is making a buck, they might be, hey, I make a living. All of us on this panel make a living. We have to make a living. I'm not saying that they are always wrong, but you have to have a little bit of skepticism. One of the things I always encourage people to do is look for the source material. Do they, in fact, relate back to a study, or do they just say neuroscience says this? That's a big red flag. They may not be intentionally misleading you, but I would wonder how well they've understood the research since they haven't chosen to share it with you. So that's something I always look for.
You're right.
I do think, yeah, I have one more thing. I don't want to overtake it, Joe, because I know you have many more questions. It is hard to stay up on it, and it is hard to read a scientific paper and make sense of it. That's something that the folks on this panel, we do for a living. So the other thing is find someone you trust who can help you translate and recognize what's valuable. And, you know, a study about a fish brain or a mouse brain might be fascinating, but might not. It doesn't always have a direct correlate to human learning yet. And that's where we have to be prepared for it too. So pick and choose your spots. You don't have to use it all. And be very, very careful of people who won't name their sources.
Can I quickly sneak in, Joe, and just add to something Margie said there as a bit of a shortcut to cautionary kind of focus. If someone is saying or presenting neuroscience that it's going to change everything you ever knew about yourself or your loved one or your co-worker, be very cautious, because what I would suggest, like Margie said, it should be making you think, well, I kind of knew that. And that's kind of what we normally do. And there's a good reason why that is the case. And neuroscience comes along and puts a spotlight on it and gives you a little bit more granularity of why, and then you can do something more effective with it. So it's not to say that there's no point in studying it or applying it, but just be wary of those people who like to make a big bang and say, I'm going to change everything you knew about the brain, because I'll be a little bit skeptical about those kind of statements.
Absolutely, I think you make a really good point there. And actually, in my column in TJ this month around the neuroscience topic, I started and said, if you read this column every month, I personally guarantee that your brain capacity will increase by 20%. You'll work faster, be funnier, and as for your sexual potency, I kind of stopped there, because you're right. The point being, we can't sort of guarantee those things.
I was sold. I was going to read it.
But I think you make some really good points about we have to be able to link back to the study. You know, my degree is around psychology, and you know, I've got a BSc, and I read these sort of scientific documents and I just want to fall asleep. I don't understand them. So, you know, it can be really challenging for us. And Olivia says, that's awesome, Joe, thank you. I would have a little bit of fun. Now, Stella, you were saying in the chat window that there's constant change in neuroscience, and it's about kind of also, you know, being able to measure something. So measurement in L&D, that's a whole other topic. But what are your thoughts at the moment, Stella?
I was just having a quick thought around the idea that you sometimes see these people saying, you know, neuroscience says, and when you do question them, they've often perhaps got, you know, one single piece of, you know, one single study that they've picked up somewhere. And you know, it might be a great study, but actually it's probably not sufficient to really say neuroscience says. So I think we just need to be careful how much evidence they've got to back stuff up. In terms of evidence, though, I think it's really interesting that we're going to have all this evidence out there to help support what we do. In the past, you know, businesses very much were driven by financial figures and kind of evidence that people could measure very well. And in L&D, we didn't have that kind of information available to us so easily. And I think now that there are, apparently in the UK, there are something like, I don't know, 30,000 psychology students. You know, it's the most popular degree in the UK, which means all those people are going to move into jobs, they're going to move into roles, they're going to move into senior roles, and they are then going to begin to understand the same sort of evidence. So I think, you know, in L&D, it's really important that we're beginning to create or amass evidence that we can then use with, you know, the future leaders who are going to understand that evidence. They might even be more interested in it than, you know.
Make a great point, and actually that leads on nicely to what Gary said in the chat window is learning and development is a cognitive process, not an event. But also a question from Olivia. So Olivia asks, I'm wondering if neuroscience can help us understand and more importantly support retention of the learned material so that once achieved, insights are available at the right time in real life. So Olivia, first of all, thank you for that. What a great question. I'm going to share that in the Q&A window so that everybody can see that. So who wants to go first on this one? Gary's got the whole hand up thing going on. Excellent. So Gary, how could neuroscience help us understand and support retention of learned material?
Yeah. So thank you, Olivia, for the question. Joe's got an option to let the to let us see those questions before they're kind of shared, and that's what prompted that learning and development is a cognitive process, not an event. And I think if we start from that understanding, this is where we start to get into the world of practicality. Okay, so often a lot of our clients get focused on the layout, who's going to be there, and the timings, and they miss the point that for anyone to learn something, maybe some stuff has to be unlearned and disconnected, and new stuff has to be layered on. And neuroscience gives a lot of some weighty evidence about how to first get through the filters of your attentional filters. There's way too much information out there. We have to block it off. So something called the RAS, the reticular activating system at the back. A short reference there would be look at the stuff from Judy Willis on RAD learning. That will fill in the gaps to a certain extent, so I won't discuss that in detail now. But there's a lot of good stuff in terms of just how do you get past some of these gatekeepers and then make the stuff kind of stay in your brain for long enough for it to have a chance to stick. But a real shortcut to learning is you have to be exposed to the information. So you have to get people's attention. It has to have, attached to a need that they have, something personal, some challenge maybe, that you've got a good chance of getting through some of these filters. But retrieval. So just blindly taking in information is one thing. It's quite passive, you could say. When you ask people a question, when you give them a test, or when you test yourself, if you do that before you go to sleep that night, that has been shown to have a huge impact on the ability for that information to stay in your brain and for it to stay up to 8 months down the line compared to a group maybe who didn't do the retrieval. They did lots of encoding, rereading. If you're a student, rereading your notes, color coding your notes and all that good stuff. But if you were to ask yourself some very simple questions, it forces your brain to kind of consolidate those fledgling connections. It strengthens them, and the studies would suggest it's much easier to recall those facts at a later date, even when you're under stress. Actually, it seems to increase under stress. So if you're presenting, for example, those who've tested themselves beforehand seem to be better at recalling some of those facts as well. So there's way more that we can say, but there's some, we should do less well is some of the advice I give, and I often don't take it. So I'm going to try and do that now.
Thank you very much, Gary. Some really good nuggets there. Let's go to Margie and then to Stella.
Okay, well, there's a really neat thing that happens when two brains or multiple brains are thinking along the same lines. They actually physically start to modulate along the same wavelength. And that must be happening to me and Gary, because my first thought was to say something about attention, because nothing happens until you pay attention. And underlying that process of attention that he's talking about and the mechanisms is survival. And so at the key, if you want people to understand it, it helps to recognize that we have the brains we have because they kept us alive. As a species, we're not the fastest, we're not the strongest, But we have remarkable brains that have tremendous pattern recognition capabilities and other capabilities, and we are constantly scanning our environment subconsciously to see whether or not there are threats, and that is what attention is all about. Attention is not a consistent focus, it is an in and out scanning. So right now, all of you are listening for a few seconds, and then you're bouncing out to check your environment, and then you're back. So one of the first things we have to do is recognize that and how attention works, which is one of the reasons why we need repetition in order to build those neural connections. But we were chatting before the session started about sleep and the power of sleep in the learning process. So I was also thrilled to see that come up. And I am breaking my own rule by working at this hour, because your brain functions so much better on a good night's sleep, and yet so many of us rob ourselves of that. And as learning professionals, if you conduct a training session in a day or a few hours and you don't revisit it the next day, you are not giving your learners that opportunity to take advantage of what happened the night before inside the brain to consolidate those new memories, those new connections. So we are just starting to understand the power of learning and how it connects with sleeping, and it's a very significant connection. So if you kind of picture a whole bunch of people in a file room running around all day, grabbing things out of the files, I remember this, I remember that, and then they connect it in different ways, and they throw all the papers out of the files. They're all on the floor, on the tables. At night, the file guys come in and they clean it all up and they organize it, but they end up refiling it in different ways. Oh, I see a connection now between this bit of knowledge and that bit of knowledge, and now everything gets refiled and reordered. And so in a very simple way, I like to explain that that's the kind of thing that's going on during sleep. So we learn during sleep. We consolidate. The learning process continues, and that's another big aha. So I would just want to reinforce.
Thank you so much. And again, some really enthusiastic answering of the questions and loads of interesting nuggets in there. And Stella, you've been sharing a whole load of stuff in the chat window very patiently whilst we've been chatting through to Gary and Margie. So what are your thoughts on this, Stella, about kind of helping with the retention of that learned material?
I think what I was just going to say was it's so difficult to respond to one thing, because you hear Gary say something and you think I want to respond to that, and then Margie says something and I want to respond to that. It was picking up on something Gary was talking about, this idea about we need to recall information in order to sort of be able to use it, and often what we do is we just instead recognize it, and that recognition of information is much simpler than recall, and we kind of get this warm fuzzy feel from recognition. Oh yeah, I recognize that, I think I know that. And that can be a real false friend to us, because when we then need to recall it, particularly if we're perhaps under pressure, we don't have that ability. So we can see it and think, looks good, but when we actually have to use it practically, it's much harder. So we need to keep testing our recall, not just, when I read this, does it look familiar? So it's about finding ways to actively, ask questions, challenge yourself, get other people to ask you questions, use the knowledge, the information, the
I think
skills.
you make a great point, Stella. I remember years and years ago in my training having a PowerPoint slide with bullet points. Yes, I used to do that. And there was a point there, so I looked at it and had the recall of, oh yes, that's the next thing I need to talk about. But as you say, I didn't have the memory of it. I kind of got there and went, yep, I have no idea what I'm talking about. I recognise that topic, but nothing else. And we've probably had instances where we've done that in our training, in job interviews, whatever it might be, or those moments where we go blank, and that's probably a whole load of other kind of brain science as well that we need to look at. Margie is sharing about Ebbinghouse's work. Still very kind of valid about reception and recall and spaced repetition and spaced learning, and making sure that we kind of actually make sure we don't have that kind of drop off. So, we're talking about learning and neuroscience and the brain, so we have to mention Ebbinghaus. It's the unwritten law, I'm afraid. So some good stuff to go and have a look at there if you haven't looked at that in a while. I've got another question coming in around accelerated learning, which I think is a really interesting area. So Paula Patterson asks, what is the role of accelerated learning principles in supporting the encoding of knowledge to commit it to the long-term memory, but also to help successful and accurate recall. So I think it's some interesting bits there. So maybe some stuff we've touched on in our question we've just been discussing. But what is the role of accelerated learning principles? So Margie, would you like to go first on that one?
Sure. Now, accelerated learning, to me, that refers to a specific body of work, and it's been around quite a while, and I'm not, maybe somebody else can remember the gentleman's name. I could Google it real quickly, but I immediately recognize it. And he's still around, I believe, or at least his company is, and he was really onto something. Accelerated learning was really one of the first attempts to apply scientific evidence to how we structure learning. So there's nothing in it that is particularly unique. It's going to focus on many of the same things that we're talking about. Attention, repetition, the use of recall and application rather than just recognition are all in there. So it's a really good, solid body of work that you can apply, but it's not necessarily, it's one of those things where some of us are just really good at packaging insights and giving it a great name, and then that becomes, we tend to maybe overstate the uniqueness or the specialness of that. So I would say, yeah, it's absolutely valid. It's not, you don't necessarily have to go buy a book on accelerated learning in order to apply those principles, though, I would say. So, because you're going to find them everywhere that there's good evidence about, a good evidentiary approach about learning. So I did want to jump in. I saw Phoebe mention about people who have a different cognitive process, only because that's kind of a pet subject of mine, because I'm actually dyslexic, and I didn't know it until I was in college learning how to be a teacher and was studying learning disabilities. Now we don't really call it that, it's just other learning. There's benefits to having your brain work a little differently. It's not always a challenge. Sometimes it gives you shortcuts and other insights. So I don't want to take a lot of time here, but Phoebe, if you were interested in pursuing that, or anybody else, that's kind of a pet interest of mine. So definitely a lot of great work being done, particularly in the K through 12. Not so much in the adult learning space and corporate training, but you see an awful lot of good work in what we in the States call kindergarten through 12th grade, in schools, and how they're going to help people who have a different way of processing.
Thank you, Margie. So some really good points there about kind of different ways of learning and the different ways that our brain processes, as well as accelerated learning. And Stella has put into the chat window about Colin Rose and the master model. And Mike also, you said Colin Rose as well. Well done, Mike. You definitely know your stuff. And Stella's shared some other bits and pieces there as well. Stella, what are your thoughts around accelerated learning principles supporting kind of to memory and then the recall again?
I think the worst thing about accelerated learning is its name, because I think it leads people to think that they're going to learn faster. And I think Gary said something earlier on about, learning is a long cognitive process. It takes a considerable amount of time. So I think there are some really useful models out there. We use the Colin Rose accelerated learning model as a way to sort of help us design and deliver training. So it's kind of a process to help you create really good learning interventions. Lots of it is backed up by the psychology and the neuroscience, but they are just kind of models of learning. So they're not the neuroscience itself, but there is evidence to show that, if you if you go through the Colin Rose model, you motivate people first, then they get to pay attention to some information, absorb some information. They get to kind of make sense of that information, start to consolidate it, put it into their brains, make links to what they already know. And then you need to create really good memory triggers, or the learners have to create good memory triggers. So when they go back and apply that learning, wherever they're going to apply it, they've got some way of recalling it. And then the other part of it is to sort of allow learners to experiment or to exhibit their knowledge, to have that opportunity to test it. And then the big part of it that I think is so important for retention is this reviewing and making sure that, 24 hours later, a few days later, a week, a month, 3 months, they reckon up to at least 6 months, if not longer. You need to keep refreshing that information, otherwise it'll just begin to drift off.
And that really kind of keys back into, that stuff that, we laugh about sometimes saying, oh, Ebbinghaus always has to come up. It's one of those things that can almost be a fun point now. But it is that point about the learning curve kind of dropping off. So thank you very much for that, Stella. So we've got a little bit of background noise as being kind of identified and echo and things. So I am keeping the speakers on mute when they're not actually speaking. So I will manage that. So do let us know in the chat window if that helps or if it doesn't help, or if you have a problem with the echo, do let me know. So I think that we're going to go into an interesting question that we've got here from Paula Patterson. So Paula says, as a facilitator, are we able to force the process to the delegate's advantage using these principles? So Paula, definitely see that you have put the word force in kind of inverted commas. Can really see that that's an interesting kind of point to your question. So as a facilitator, are we able to force any of these processes but to the delegate's advantage? So Gary, let me unmute you and come to you first on this one. What are your thoughts?
I was thinking you could probably force in a very Machiavellian way. If people feel that you are forcing, they're likely to resist if they don't like it, as we probably all can imagine. But that doesn't mean to say we can't use our understanding of what is likely to work and then weave it into the delegate's context so that it's more kind of palatable. So I wanted to say earlier about the idea of that flipped classroom, that you do stuff before people come to a facilitated session, and that idea of staged repetition begins before they come to the facilitated session. So they've got an opportunity to critically evaluate and all that good stuff, which sounds great on paper, but in reality that means pre-work. And you send that stuff out and everyone goes, oh, well, do you know how busy I am already? You haven't even brought me into the process. So there's a bit of a balance to be played in terms of, we know it's good for them, but if they feel forced into it, they probably resist it, not do it very well. So there's something I try to talk to clients and certainly delegates about how the brain learns. And that's why we're doing things in a certain way. And that could be a short video, some bullet points maybe, just to kind of warm them up to why we're getting them to do things in the way that we're asking them to. The idea of nudge psychology. So you don't tell them to do anything, but you tell them lots of other people have done this and had lots of benefit from it. Or when we meet and you've all had a chance to think about this stuff beforehand, it will really help with discussions. Some of those more tricky ways of leading people to the trough to drink from it, as I think without that you're probably going to find people shutting up barriers, skewing their perception of what you're saying to them, and it'll probably backfire, even though it's coming from good intentions. So I think if we think of a model we use with clients about how to design learning will be, think of the architecture, the design, the delivery and the embedding stages. And then how can you put those together in a way that they work and you're going to get what you want out of it. So it's something as simple as 20 minutes of focus time. That's pretty much all. I'm not sure on the research at the moment, so don't quote me too much. I think it comes from David Rock. It's probably worth looking at. But he suggests about 20 minutes is the maximum of attention span to just digest information. So that's the consumption of knowledge. Something has to shift or change, a question, a different speaker, a video, an activity. And then I'd be encouraging the consumption of knowledge. You've given them some, the creation of knowledge. You've given them something, a nugget, a research model, or whatever it might be. Now they need a bit of time to work out, what do I make of it? Any questions? Do I agree with it? How do I apply it? So I know I'm probably going a little bit too much now, but it kills me not talking when everyone else is talking. There's so much good stuff to say. But I think Short answer is yes, as long as they don't realise you're forcing them. Or they can see why you're forcing them, that they've already kind of inoculated against it.
Thank you, Gary, and I can absolutely hear that kind of killing you not talking about stuff. And it's one of the challenges of having three amazing speakers on a webinar. But it's about perhaps having different perspectives and different areas. So I really appreciate that you're saying that, Gary. Thank you. And lots of people in the chat window are saying some similar things. It's about kind of motivation. Stella says what Gary's saying relates to really well to the motivation stage of accelerated learning. Jane says really importantly, even better if they can work out their own why, so kind of handing that over. So some good stuff on that. And Ken says, I like the bomb method. I like to disrupt their thought pattern on arrival at the training or event. So some really good stuff going on. And Keith says about the webinar, yes, different voices keeps the brain tuned in. I was about to say that, but you know what? It went straight out of my head. So my own attention was lacking there, Keith. Thank you very much. So let's come to Margie for a really quick answer about that forcing delegates, if you have anything to add to that, Margie. Otherwise, we've got another question that we can come to. So Margie, let me just unmute you and anything to add to what Gary was saying?
You know, I think Gary did a great job on that one, so let's just go on.
Our next question is from Jane, and it's a really interesting one, Jane, that you're sharing. I'm really interested in the field of vertical development and adult constructive development, but struggling to find any research related to neuroscience. Now, I'm not really sure that I even know what vertical development is, or is that just constructivism? I'm not really sure. Margie, have you got anything to add on that?
Well, to be honest, when I saw that question, I quickly went over and Googled it because I couldn't say for sure that I knew what it was. And, you know, nobody can know everything. And here is a nice a summary of it. And from what I can tell, it is a theory. Remember, we're talking about models, and I think it's important to distinguish a model is something that is basically, it's a scientific guess of how things work. And it becomes adopted if it is good at predicting behavior. So, well, all these models we talk about, they have a little bit different approach to how the brain works and how they think people learn. And to the extent that they match, that we can use them, that they're useful, they're valid. I am not seeing a lot of really current information on it. The most in Sage Journals, which is an excellent collection of educational psychology journals. The most cited piece was written in 1990. There is an interesting kind of a blog post on using it for leadership. But again, it's going back to much earlier work. So that doesn't mean it's invalid. It probably just means it's not the hot thing anymore. And that's just with a real quick search. So, you know, I could be all wet about that. But it's the idea that we build our learning in phases. Now, it's built on, from what I can tell, constructivism, which is a model that I think, a much broader model that I think is still quite valid, which is all of us build our own reality. We construct our own interpretation of the world. So not any person here is, we're all here together, but we're all experiencing our own reality. We bring our own perceptions to it, and what we take away is going to be unique and different. And to that extent, I think that's absolutely borne out in the neuroscience, that we'll watch two people's brains experiencing the same thing, and the brain patterns are not identical. So therefore, something unique is going on there. So hopefully that helped you a little bit.
Thank you. And Jane's actually shared some of the current references for vertical development in the chat window. So thank you, Jane, because that's something certainly I hadn't heard of, and probably other people are in a similar situation, or not. They might be cleverer than me. So that's a really good one. And in the question pod, I've just seen come in. I'm going to copy that, Mark. So this is from Mark Hawkswell. So thank you very much, Mark. I'm just going to paste that into the chat window about the work of some other people as well. So just to share that with everybody. You know, we're coming towards the end of our discussion webinar. We're not finished yet. Don't worry, no one's going anywhere. But, you know, the whole point of this that we're talking about is how can we remember stuff? How can we do something and make this really valid and valuable in the workplace? So what we're going to do is we're going to move into a bit of a reflection piece and have some discussion there. So our guests are still here, but we are going to come off webcam. So let's have a little wave goodbye for a moment, certainly from video, but they are going to stay here and we'll still be chatting to them. Let's come into our reflection piece. And we've got a drawing tool that I've switched on for you here. We're going to have a practice before we get into the actual question. So please just go and have a play with what we call the T-text tool. So it's on the left side of your screen. If you click the T-text tool, click on the screen, just type your name and then just click away again. Or you can type hello, you can type whatever you like as long as it's polite for good company. And that's just practicing the text tool. If you want to, you can go and use a pen tool. It's entirely up to you. If you're thinking, oh no, I've written over the top of someone else, we've got an arrow tool or a little kind of kite we can actually kind of move around. So it looks like a whole load of you are using this tool really well, which is brilliant. You can also use the chat window if it's not working for you. Let's go into our reflection. As Margie says, reflection is an important form of learning, so that's why we've got it here. So let me go and ask you this question. What's your action point from today? We've spent about the last 45 minutes discussing workplace, applying neuroscience to the workplace. What are you actually going to do now? So use your T-text tool. Go and share something. If you want to put your name in, that would be absolutely great. If you don't want to, you don't have to. But let's go and type something on that whiteboard and let us know, what are you going to be doing? And somebody said, take a couple of days off to read all these great references and articles. There's been a lot of stuff here, hasn't there? Review the BPS and some articles mentioned today. Someone says, find out and read more about how neuroscience can be brought into our L&D workshops. Thank you, Anna, for that. At the bottom left, send out my list of references and look into virtual developments. That's from Margie. Do some research, as a lot of what has been said has gone over my head and I'm confused. Oh, I'm sorry that you're confused. You know, let's go to Gary on this. Gary, if you're confused about something, is that a good state for learning? Does that mean, you know, you're switching off, or does it mean you're kind of piqued your interest? What do you think, Gary?
I suppose it depends on the emotional connotation behind it. Are you confused and motivated, or are you confused and demotivated? I'd be thinking, get clear about what are you confused about. It will help you formulate questions. You can go and speak to Professor Google, and you know, they know a lot, don't they? So I'd be thinking about, how do I feel about that confusion? Is it a call to action? And if it's not, maybe reflect on, well, why not? What can I do to chop the problem up into something smaller that I can approach and feel motivated to take on?
Great, thank you, Gary. So some really interesting points there about confusion. And Stella in the chat window says, I heard a great phrase, confusion is one of the steps on the way to enlightenment, which is lovely. And Jane says, have a lovely sleep and let the non-conscious remedy the confusion. So hopefully that's confusion, but kind of motivated, as Gary was saying. Lots of things that you're sharing here. I don't think I can get to read all of these out, but lots of you are saying review, read things, follow up, research. Somebody has said review my teaching style, which is really good. And somebody said definitely motivated to learn more, which is brilliant. Value and encourage the role of sleep in learning. Margie in the chat window said, yes, sleep on it. Somebody has said to build up the flipped classroom more than I currently do. That idea of sharing before and after as well. What else have we got? Explore the RAD learning and spaced learning. Yeah, some really good stuff around spaced learning. I'm certainly starting to build in more and more and more of these things into the design of the stuff that I'm doing and the delivery of them. In the middle of the whiteboard, somebody says change the focus on retention supporting exercises. So more happens in the morning. Also look up some of the names mentioned in the chat, which is absolutely great. So thank you for that. So we have Janet, Danielle and Debbie are all on microphone, but we actually haven't heard anything from them throughout today. We usually like to get people involved a little bit more. So perhaps Janet or Danielle, would you care to unmute and just tell us here, what are you taking away from this and what are you thinking about doing? So you might have put something on the whiteboard already, but Janet, tell us a bit more about what you're thinking of doing after this session.
Well, I think some of the things that I do sort of almost instinctively and know that that's good practice. I think what I need to do is go back to those things and think, okay, why am I doing that? For instance, my comment was about the flipped classroom. So I know that I send stuff out to people beforehand and start to get them to think about what it is they're going to do when they come to one of my sessions. But the idea of actually explaining why I'm doing that, I don't really go down that line. And so so thinking about why I do things, perhaps in a more constructive way, might be one of the main things that I'm going to do today.
Brilliant. So I really like what you're saying there, Janet, about actually probably what you're doing is you're doing it instinctively through years of experience, really good learning theory, you know, loads of good feedback, but actually having the underpinning understanding of why you're doing it. Is that about confidence and then doing it better?
I think it's about not being lazy, to be honest. I think it's about sort of saying, okay, my sense is that doing this works really well, but actually, am I doing it as well as I possibly could be doing it? And committing to that a bit more, perhaps.
Janet, I think that's absolutely brilliant, and I love your point about being lazy. Sometimes it's lack of time, but you're right. It's if we've got the impetus there to go and update ourselves as professionals, and let's face it, you all do because you're all here today, then I think that's a really good point. So it's making sure that you understand what's going on and the changes in our industry as well. So Janet, thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
And Danielle, I wonder if you wanted to unmute and just share about, you know, what you've learned, what you're going to do afterwards.
Sure, I'd just really like to say thanks to everybody, most especially the speakers. I think for me, as well as reviewing the why I'm doing what I'm doing, I think one of the things that I tend to maybe get lazy about is just dive into material with people because it's exciting. And I don't necessarily empower or enable people to work out their own why, to really get them engaged and motivated about what this really means for them, how is it going to enable them to do whatever it is they want to do more effectively, or in what way will it really make a difference, rather than getting into the what, which is always somehow so appealing. Actually really setting that piece right up front about the why, so that the brain is engaged in that way, because this idea that the brain is constantly scanning environments for threats, if it understands the why, I'm wondering, and I'm certainly not an expert in this field by any stretch of the imagination, if that somehow creates more of a sense of reward and less of threat. So I was really interested in perhaps going back and doing more of that and looking at how I can do that more effectively.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much. I really like that interesting point about reward and threat. Danielle, thank you so much. Stella, what are your thoughts about that reward and the threat part that we were talking about there? Is that something, let me unmute you, Stella, is that something that, you know, there's a neuroscience element to that you know of? So Stella, I've unmuted you. Are you there?
Jo, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Yeah, there's lots of interesting stuff around about reward and threat. I think David Rock did a good job with his SCARF model, so getting people to sort of understand what creates a threat for people and why they might respond in a not necessarily helpful way. So that's a really interesting idea. Reward is always hugely important in terms of people learning. If we get rewarded for learning, it really helps us do more of it and sort of walk towards it this way rather than walk away from it. But I think learning itself is its own reward, and if we can make learning enjoyable and get people to do the learning themselves rather than it being facilitators who are throwing information at people and hoping some of it sticks, then I think that the natural the endorphins that get created, apparently when we're curious we have a burst of dopamine, and we kind of really like dopamine because that makes us feel good. We get we're sort of addicted to dopamine. So there's lots of neuroscience behind that. It's probably a little complicated to go into right here.
Thank you, Stella. You really shared some good insight there, and again, just giving us more to go and have a look at and to think about. So thank you very much for that. And we're coming to the end of our session. I can't believe it. You're sharing some great stuff in the chat window, some more stuff to go and look at and read. This is why reflection is so important, because actually even more stuff has come out at this point. So thank you very much to everybody for that. So we're coming to our last moment. Let's just have a very last quick thought from our speakers before we wrap up. So Margie, last quick thought on what we've discussed today.
Your brain has already changed significantly by the ideas that have come across today. So continue on that path, continue to push your curiosity, continue to enjoy the confusion and the journey, and think about it again tomorrow. And see if you don't have some clearer thoughts about and some different action items. So treat yourself as a learner every day, and that will help you become a better practitioner in learning science.
Thank you, Margie, so much for that. And Gary, let's see what your thoughts are.
So before we started the webinar, the presenters were talking. I said I was joking about starting a blog about I don't know anything about people as the title. And I think the chat has actually consolidated it to a certain degree, but I think it's a healthy point of view to have. Okay, so as we were discussing and the references are going around, I'm still thinking, wow, there's so much stuff I don't know and I haven't read and I need to inform myself about. But I see that as a very positive place to be. If we feel complacent about our knowledge, we don't look for the new. So I think these kind of activities make me feel I do know some stuff, but there's a whole heap of stuff that I don't know. So it spurs me on to continue looking and thinking about how to apply things. And I think that's a really healthy place for all of us to be.
Gary, really well said. Thank you so much. And Stella, what are your parting thoughts?
I think for me, it's still really important to recognise that, if we're delivering training, for want of a better word, it's not us that really has to do the work. It's the learners who are having to do the work. It's their brains that need to change. And our role is to create an environment and opportunity for them to do that and to help them understand how learning happens. So to sort of help them understand that, they can't just expect to have a piece of information and it's going to stick, that they need to really understand what learning is about themselves in order to learn most effectively. So, sleeping on it, taking, time to do things beforehand, reviewing and reflecting and repeating and continuing to develop that kind of change that's happening in the brain.
Thank you so much, Stella. Some really good key points there. And let's also come to Debbie Carter. Debbie is our editor-in-chief here at Training Journal. So Debbie, just unmute and just, what are your final thoughts on what you've heard here today?
My thoughts are that it's really important as professionals that we get our information from the right sources. Neuroscience, I think, is still, we're only scratching the surface of what the mind's doing. So I think we need to build up a network of people like Stella, Gary and Margie, who we maybe can bounce ideas off when we see some new ideas coming forward, because we have to be sure that we're implementing the right stuff, if you like. Actually, one of our columnists, Don Taylor, wrote about the amount of material that is online and available to us all, which isn't actually accurate or true at times. So I think things like these webinars and various trusted forums are a great way of ensuring that we build our knowledge of these complex areas and know how best to apply them in our practice. So I think that's what would be my final word on the subject.
Thank you, Debbie. I think you summarised that really well. And so it's probably about time we wrapped up. Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead a bit quick there. A huge thank you to our speakers, Stella, Gary and Margie. I've shared all their details in the chat box. It's been absolutely fascinating chatting to them all. You know that the webinars are all going to be available on Training Journal. You know you can go on to TJwow and have a chat there. You know, also there's our Training Journal forum as well. So if you've got further questions on this, you can go and have a chat there in a discussion. And we're looking at current and best practices in organisational development for our next webinar. Thank you everybody so much, and we will speak to you hopefully next month.